Welcome to Good Journeys with Second Mountain, the show shining a spotlight on lessons learnt from trails travelled. Coming up on this episode.
Many people say, oh, poor thing, spending 5 years in isolation with no books or papers, chained to the wall, sleeping on the floor, no companionship, never speaking to anyone, blindfolded when anyone came in the room, all that. Yes, okay, it was tough, it was difficult. But within every situation of deprivation and difficulty, often if you look for it, there are the seeds of a new opportunity, something new. In my case, although it may sound crazy, I really value that experience in many ways. I don't look at it, I wouldn't wish to go through it again. Of course I wouldn't. I mean, that'd be silly to say that. But I gained a lot from it. Before I was in captivity, I always had sympathy for people who were on the margins of life. The prisoner, the homeless, those who found themselves desolate. I'd always had sympathy. But captivity changed that into empathy.
Hello and welcome to episode 23 of Good Journeys with Second Mountain, the show that takes a deep dive into trails travelled and lessons learnt along the way. I'm your host and the founder of Second Mountain Comms, Ben Veal. I'm passionate about helping good people do good by sharing inspiring stories, and I hugely appreciate you joining me and my very special guest today. If you're new to the show, you can now discover over 20 honest and powerful conversations by subscribing to Good Journeys with Second Mountain, wherever you get your podcasts, and watch all of our interviews on YouTube. Now it is my genuine honour to introduce my guest for today, Sir Terry Waite KCMG CBE. That is a lot of letters. Welcome to the show, Terry. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Very nice to see you. And
You
nice
too.
to be here this morning. Yeah.
So KCMG, that is a very new addition to your title.
Well, it stands for Knight Commander of the British Empire. And the British Empire hardly exists now. And I don't have a white horse. But when one receives an honour like that, which is a very considerable honour, one recognises that there are a lot of other people who've made that possible. People who work without any acknowledgement and without any recognition. And when I actually do go to the palace to receive my honour in November, technically I've got it now, but when I go to receive it formally, afterwards, many people go to, a posh lunch or a posh restaurant. But I said, no, that's not the way to do it for me, because so many people are behind this. So I'm going to go to Emmaus Community for the Homeless in Greenwich, and we're having a reception there. And that will be a way of saying, look, this honour is shared with the homeless people in the Emmaus communities who've not just accepted charity, but have determined to work and get themselves back into reasonable living life. There we are, as I say. A lot of letters, but a lot of people too.
Well, a lot of letters and a very rich journey that you've lived that's led you to this point. So I want to just kick off this conversation with a very brief introduction. So here is yours. This is when I take a deep breath. So Sir Terry Waite is a British Quaker, Anglican, humanitarian and author. In the 1980s, he worked as the Archbishop of Canterbury's special envoy, travelling to the Middle East and negotiating the release of many hostages in Iran, Libya and Lebanon. On January 20th, 1987, he was taken hostage in Beirut and held in captivity for 1,763 days, the first 4 years of which were spent in solitary confinement. 2 years after his release, he wrote his first book, the international bestselling memoir Taken on Trust, chronicling his experiences from memory. Sir Terry holds a number of honorary doctorates both in the UK and overseas, is a highly sought-after public speaker, and supports a wide range of humanitarian causes, including serving as the long-standing president of homelessness charity Emmaus UK and being the co-founder and president of Hostage International. So let's start then with perhaps talking about those charities that are so dear to your heart and that you've been involved with for so long. You've been president of Emmaus, I believe, for several decades, in fact, not long after your release. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. How it happened was, you mentioned that I worked as an envoy for the Archbishop of Canterbury, And when I came out of captivity, I decided that I wouldn't take up my former job, but I'd try and live life in the way that I thought I ought to live it now. And that was by giving my time to the various organizations like Emmaus and Hostage and so on and so forth, not taking money from them and earning my own living by writing and lecturing. Now, that was a big step because I still had a mortgage and I still had a family, and I'd never had the courage to do that had I not been through the experience in captivity and experienced those years. And so Robert Runcie said, how about helping us get Emmaus off the ground? It was a new movement, and it was founded in France after the World War II and was just starting in this country with one porter cabin and a very dedicated worker and a windswept site just outside Cambridge. And so I went along and I opened the first community. Today we have 30 communities all over the UK. And the principle is this, that a homeless person will come into a community, they'll get a good standard of accommodation because we respect them as people and enable them to get their dignity back. Travel lodge accommodation, a little room with a shower and facilities. They agree to work according to their capacity. Work is provided on premises. Goods are donated and renovated and sold. And they can stay until such time as they feel able to move back into so-called normal life. And it works. I mean, each community has about 25 to 30 people. And some stay for a long time, some stay for a few months. But I say, although technically it's a charity, in fact, people are coming in to work. They're coming in to be determined to at least help themselves, and by so doing, help the wider community. I mean, I think of many communities now. I think of one in the north of England at Motley, where it's made a tremendous difference to the sociality of that community. People gather there. They have all sorts of, some have a little restaurant run by the homeless, all sorts of things. So it's a very worthwhile development, and it's really developed well, thanks to, the hard work of many homeless people who've made it what it is.
So it's a very empowering organisation then, in terms of helping people to get a bit of a restart, but then to build for themselves.
Yes, and you should never categorize homeless people. Sometimes there's a general stereotype that they're all wastrels, drug addicts, alcoholics, can't do anything. Of course, some have had problems. Some have had drug problems, some have had alcohol problems, some have been in prison. There are others as well who've got entirely different experience, have just not been able to pay the rent and have been forced out onto the streets. I remember one lady, she'd been a civil servant. Because of illness, she lost her job. She lost her accommodation. And what she used to do was get on a bus at night in Trafalgar Square and sit on the upper deck and spend the night on the bus, traveling up and down to the suburb. And she was a very well-educated, very able person. It's often said that the vast majority of people are only a couple of paychecks away from being homeless themselves. It's a pretty difficult situation. There are the occasional few people who, one might say, swing the lead. Occasional few, very few. It's certainly in the Emmaus community not, because the community itself will maintain its own internal discipline. And if someone is there just not to be a member of the community, they're told by other members, come on, put yourself in good order and work with us.
I think it's very true what you said there about the couple of paychecks removed. I mean, I lost my job about 3 weeks into the pandemic, very unexpectedly and without notice. And luckily, I had been doing public relations and communications for so long that I had a network and I was able to build a business, and I was financially able to make it through just about the pandemic. But we've seen that. We've obviously, we're going through a cost of living crisis now. We're weathering recessions. It's very much front of mind, isn't it? The homelessness situation now, about how relevant it is to society today.
It's very, very relevant. I think in Emmaus, we tend to work with people who are rather more on the extreme edge of homelessness, the ones who've been sleeping out on the streets. And I mean, I remember when I was 75, which is almost 10 years ago now.
Wow.
When I was 75, I gave a little party at a restaurant in London. A friend organized it for me, and I invited one of the homeless people. It was the Roast restaurant in Borough Market, and it's upstairs, and you look down at the market. And I'd invited some of the Emmaus companions, formerly homeless people, to join me. And one of them looked through the window and he said, "You know, I never thought I should be here eating in this restaurant. For 10 years, I've slept under the tables in that
Oh,
market." You know, and that's not uncommon. I remember meeting two young lads, one of the Hastings or Dover communities. They'd been fostered, and at the age of whatever it was, 16, they were kicked out. You know, fend for yourself. They'd nowhere to go. They pitched a tent in the winter on a strip of land and lived in this tent, and eventually found Emmaus. When they came to us, both of them were suffering from trench foot.
mm.
Now, I thought trench foot died out in World War One, but
Yes.
it didn't. And that's the sort of hardship these lads had to face. Fortunately, they came to us, they got back into life again. I mean, you know, one could repeat dozens and dozens of stories about the situation. It's a worthwhile movement. It's a good movement.
I imagine, you know, you talk about some of those circumstances there, and there's clearly very strong parallels to your time in captivity, and especially from a health and well-being point of view, the various things that you had to endure during that time. How much does that perspective help you in your work with Emmaus?
Well, it helps very considerably. I mean, many people say, "Oh, poor thing, you know, spending 5 years in isolation with no books or papers, chained to the wall, sleeping on the floor, no companionship, never speaking to anyone, blindfolded when anyone came in the room, all that." Yes, okay, it was tough. It was difficult. But within every situation of deprivation and difficulty, often if you look for it, there are the seeds of a new opportunity, something new. In my case, although it may sound crazy, I really value that experience in many ways. I don't look at it, I wouldn't wish to go through it again. Of course I wouldn't. I mean, I'd be silly to say that. But I gained a lot from it. Before I was in captivity, I always had sympathy for people who were on the margins of life. You know, the prisoner, the homeless, those who found themselves desolate. I'd always had sympathy. But captivity changed that into empathy. Sympathy is to feel sorry for. Empathy is to know in your own being what it's like to have nothing, what it's like to be kicked around, what it's like to be brutalized, what it's like to be in the depths of despair at times. And that's a valuable gift. When you know that in yourself, you say, right, I don't want others to have to suffer that. I don't want others to have to go through that. And that's given me a powerful, as you say, a powerful tool, if you like, to be able to give my time in the way that I've been able to do it.
Thank you so much for being with us for this inspiring conversation today on the Good Journeys with Second Mountain podcast. We'll return to our guest interview very soon, but I want to just take a few seconds now to thank our partners on the show, Resilient Leaders Elements, and tell you all about the positive change they're making in the world. We live in uncertain times where the only constant is change. Resilience has never mattered more, and it's much more than just a buzzword to the team at RLE. Leadership is about resilience, and RLE are focused on making world-class leadership development available to all, training people worldwide to build the skill sets needed to become resilient leaders. RLE's highly respected Resilient Leaders Development Program is a bespoke development tool that's perfect for leaders of all levels, and you can sign up right now. So if you want to turbocharge your leadership growth and become more resilient both in the workplace and in your personal life, there's never been a better time to start your journey. Visit resilientleaderselements.com now to find out more.
You spoke about how once you were released from captivity, you had a couple of pathways you could have taken, one of which would have been returned to, you know, the path you were on before and the journey you were on before with your work. The other was to pursue writing and public speaking and humanitarian causes. You wrote Taken on Trust very much in your head whilst you were denied pen and paper. How long was it after being released that you felt that you could sit down and actually put that to paper? Because you've charted your experiences so vividly and minutely. How much of a challenge was it to relive that experience?
Well, it's Taken on Trust is a fairly large book, and that indicates that I must have a large head.
Lot of memories, lot of life lived. But I mean, I struggle to even remember what I did yesterday. Yet the detail that you've managed to chronicle and timeline every part of your captivity is incredible, interspersed, of course, with the life that you'd lived leading up to that point.
Yeah, well, what happened was this, that when I came out of captivity, I was elected to a fellowship at Trinity Hall, Cambridge. And they said to me, would you like an apartment? We've got an apartment for you. I said, no, just let me have an ordinary student's room. And so I got a little student's room with a bed and a table and the wardrobe, and that was it. And facilities down the corridor. And I sat at that desk and I began to put on paper that which I had recollected over the years. And it took about 12 months to do that, to get it down. And as you say, it's a book that moves between my experiences of life and then relating them to the experiences of captivity. My editor said to me at the time, you've chosen a very ambitious structure. If it works, good. If it doesn't, you might have to rewrite. And when we came to the end, he said, no rewriting. Leave it as it is. That's it. The structure really indicates the way of thinking in captivity, because in captivity, your mind goes back to previous events. You think of childhood, you think of different experiences in life, and you live them in your imagination. And then suddenly you're brought up with a jolt because you're back in the reality of the confinement. So the structure of that book is as important to my mind as the actual content of it.
I think the structure works incredibly well because obviously it creates a very rich narrative, doesn't it? And a very dynamic flow in between these periods of captivity with obviously very little happening, but you really appreciate in the small minutiae of a change in a day or a circumstance versus a life that was incredibly richly lived.
Well, I'm glad you think that. Some people, one or two people, have said they found that difficult, this moving from one thing to another. But it is, in fact, as I've already said, that is how one's mind works in that sort of a situation. And if you've never experienced that situation, you can, well, perhaps you wouldn't understand that as well as some others.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think probably the closest that nearly everyone will have ever gone through to what you experienced was, obviously a very fraction of what you experienced, but the lockdown of 2020, where suddenly to a degree, our freedom was taken away as a society. Now, very, very different. And I don't want to draw parallels between the two, but that's probably the closest that many have experienced to what you went through in terms of kind of enforced solitude.
Yeah, there've been mixed views about that, haven't there? I mean, some people have said it was a refreshing experience to be free from some of the pressures of everyday life. And then others have said, yes, that was good for a while, but after a while, it began to take its toll. And I think it was particularly difficult for many of those people who were living alone, or who had to face bereavement, couldn't get to see the person for whom they had care. So, I mean, I think it was particularly difficult for them. I was a bit concerned myself when I was thrust into solitary confinement, because I've read that people who spent long periods of time in solitary often lost their wits, became mentally ill. And one way to combat that is to keep your mind alive, to keep thinking. And the writing helped me keep my mind alive. And that's why I was able, in a sense, to retain a great deal of the detail, much of which now, if you asked me now, I would have not been able to recollect it. But it's there in print now. It's there in the book.
Did you write? Was it almost like writing two books in parallel? Did you first chronicle your captivity years and then intersperse your?
I just wrote it straight, one chapter at a time. Yeah,
That's
it just
that's
came to
that's an
me.
incredible
Just came
gift.
to me.
That's a really incredible gift to be able to do that, to be able to move between those sequences and very different
Yeah.
emotional
I made
periods.
very few notes, actually, very few notes. I just wrote it out. And the interesting story about Trinity Hall, to whom I owe a great debt, they're a great fellowship there from the students and staff of Trinity Hall. When I came out of captivity, I wasn't supposed to bring anything with me, but I managed to smuggle out my blindfold, which I'd worn for so many years, and a little magnifying glass that eventually they gave me towards the end of captivity so that I could read. When I got books after about 3 years, and it was a chipped piece of glass, and I brought this out with me. When I got to Trinity Hall, I put these items into an envelope in the desk. When the manuscript was finished, I took them out and gave them to the college, and they put them amongst their treasures. Now, and when the Queen, the late Queen, and the Duke of Edinburgh came to Trinity Hall, they saw these items, and I explained to them their significance. So there are some relics there. As yet, they have to perform a miracle, but
I remember seeing there's a photograph of them, isn't there, in the book? And I remember looking at that photograph and just being, because that's really your worldly possessions, isn't it? But represent your.
That was it. That's all I had. That's all I had. Yes.
Incredible. One thing that kind of really jumped out at me from your time when you're describing being in captivity is how you kind of developed a relationship with the guards. You seem to kind of, that you've described it as half guest, half prisoner. I know your guards changed and there wasn't that regularity, but there are obviously some personalities where you, to a degree, got to know them as time went on. And clearly, throughout your captivity, you continued to be very respectful and gracious always towards the guards. I mean, how much do you think that made a crucial difference in surviving the experience, not just with your life intact, but also with your sense of self and identity?
Well, I don't believe, for example, that I suffered from Stockholm syndrome, which is, as it's described, where you are so taken by the captors that you almost join forces with them. I never went that way, but I had some understanding of why they did what they did. And I think if you can, in all life, if you can understand what motivates people, what starts them off to do some certain things, you have, well, a much better understanding. For example, many of these young lads who were guarding me and guarding others had been drawn into this organization by a charismatic leader. They'd suffered not necessarily economic deprivation all the time, but they'd always been, in a sense, the bottom of a pile in terms of low esteem and their low positions in the whole hierarchy of society. So along comes a charismatic leader and said, look, if you want to improve things for yourself and for this country, join us. So they joined the group, and there's no escape. Once they're in, they're in. And all sorts of things can happen. I mean, I remember one occasion, John McCarthy and Brian Keenan, two other hostages who were kept together. The food became very bad for them, and they complained. They complained to the head man, who eventually came to see them. He said, "What are you getting?" And they said, well, they told him, and he said, "Oh, that's not right." And he looked into it and discovered that the young guard, who had been given money to buy food, had spent half on food and pocketed the other half. So they took him out and they shot him, because they said, if you're cheaters in small matters like that, well, you'll cheat us in the long run. If someone comes along with a big bribe, you'll give the whole group away. Now, that's just an example of how, when a young person gets caught up in an organization like that, there's often no escape. And that's the same dynamic that operates in drug gangs today. They come in, there's easy money. Someone says, look, you can earn quite a lot of money. Just all you've got to do is just distribute these goods, these drugs. Before you know where they are, they're into it, and there's no way out. And how many youngsters are killed or suffer tremendously bad health consequences as a result of this? They're caught. And so one has to get to the root of the issue in many of these cases and say, Why is it that people are behaving as they're behaving? What is it that's got them to that position? And deal with the root causes. And I don't think often in society we deal enough with root issues and get those right, because that's where we have to be.
How are you looking to the work with Hostage International? Can you tell me a bit about the founding of that organisation and what you're looking to do through that?
Yeah, well, when I came out, I got lots of letters from families who had a family member, either a son or a relative or whatever, who disappeared and been captured. And they asked me for help. They said, we're not getting help from the Foreign Office. They ring us up every week, but they don't seem to understand our needs. Can you help us? I did my best to help them. I give an example of that, what the sort of very small thing. One lady, her husband was taken hostage, and she had no access to him. She needed insurance money. Now, insurance money was quite a substantial sum which she needed. So she applied to the insurance company. The insurance company said, yes, you can have the money. We just need your husband's signature. But she said, my husband's in captivity. They said, well, in that case, you can't get his signature. You can't have the money. Well, I mean, that sounds stupid now. This is a few years ago. But of course, we in Hostage International immediately got into touch with the insurance company and, of course, sorted the matter out. One just small thing. But I then realized, trying to deal with all these different issues, that we needed to institutionalize this because there was a need. And so I got trustees together and we formed a charity, Hostage UK initially, which is now Hostage International. And thanks to some extremely good people who joined me, that organization is now thriving and flourishing. We actually, the Foreign Office have changed very much. We do training for the Foreign Office. We do training for, as I speak, the head of Hostage International is on her way to Australia to do training for people for the Foreign Department in Australia. We have links with Canada. We've set up independently in America, and we're working all over the world. Because at any one given moment, there are something like 2,000 people taken hostage even today, which is incredible. And I mean, there are so many stories. Our work is, we keep it highly confidential. We don't publicize a great deal, which on the one hand does make it a bit difficult when it comes to fundraising, because fundraising, we depend on charitable trusts, on individuals, and we do get a certain grant from the Foreign Office, but we don't take more than we really need, because we want to maintain and feel it essential to maintain our independence as a charity. We mustn't become in the pocket of anybody, and certainly we are not political. We mustn't get into that field. Our work is purely humanitarian, purely supporting hostage families and returning hostages and enabling them to make the best of life.
And it's a difficult tightrope in which to traverse, isn't it? The fundraising, you obviously have to raise those funds to continue to do the work you're doing, but obviously you need to remain true to your organisational values.
Yeah, well, we've got an evening coming up being held in the Old Bailey, actually.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And the hostage, John will be there, John McCarthy, who's now become also one of our, and I'll be there. And if anybody's interested in coming along to that, just look up Hostage International on the web. Look up Hostage International UK on the web and come along to the evening. That is a fundraiser. There'll be a charge for admission, but also it should be an opportunity for people to see inside the Old Bailey if they haven't been there before.
Oh, what a fantastic opportunity. I'll be sure to give that, I'll add that to the show notes for this episode and be sure to share that via our channels as well. That sounds fantastic. There's a quote that jumped out at me. In taking on trust, you come to a realization that you say, perhaps I need this period of solitude to allow myself to settle after years of activity. If I can embrace solitude as a friend, I might find healing. Did you ever fully manage to embrace solitude during your time in captivity?
To embrace solitude, it's a long, long process. It really is not something that comes to you overnight. But the answer to that is, yes, I did. Never fully, never completely. I don't think anything ever full or complete in this life. But yes, I did. At one time, I could never really. I felt acute loneliness at times, even though I'm married with a family and children and many, many friends and acquaintances. I still found this deep, deep inner loneliness at times. And that's gone. I don't feel that now. It's gone. Because, and I think part of the answer is in this whole complex business of growing into our fullness as human beings, is to begin to know yourself. And in a sense, know yourself for what you are, your strong points and your weak points. When you come across your weak points and your failings, well, acknowledge them and don't be despairing about them. We're all human beings. We all make mistakes. But have that forgiving attitude towards yourself. But if you're going to do that towards yourself, you must have it towards other people. And then the key word, and this key word runs through all major religions, and it runs predominantly through the Christian faith, and that is the word love. Learn to love yourself and love your neighbor as yourself. And that's key. It's not easy to do. It's very difficult. It's not an easy process.
Thanks once again for being with us for another inspiring conversation on the Good Journeys pod. At Second Mountain, we firmly believe that resilience lies at the heart of all good journeys, and our friends over at Resilient Leaders Elements are deeply passionate about making world-class leadership development available to all. RLE now has an exciting opportunity for those who share the belief that anyone can be a resilient leader. This is open to anyone who'd value an opportunity to collaborate with like-minded professionals from around the world. Their global Resilient Leaders Elements accreditation program gives you the chance to help others become more confident in who they are and what they do as a leader. The program is facilitated by an experienced Resilient Leaders consultant who will guide you through the journey step by step. You'll then be welcomed into a worldwide network of like-minded resilient leadership specialists. So if you're passionate about developing resilient leadership in yourself and others, why not consider training to become a Resilient Leaders consultant? Visit resilientleaderselements.com now and find out more.
And I can't claim to be great at that. I mean, I have a long, long way to go. But that's the key. There's the key to it.
Do you find that when you came out of your time in captivity that your pace of life naturally slowed? Did you feel like you wanted to? Did you just feel like you needed to live at a different pace after that period?
Well, I did for the first year, certainly, when I was writing. My pace of life was gradually warming up, so to speak, because, looking back, you sit for 5 years on the floor and you've nothing. I mean, you don't speak to anybody. And for the first 2 or 3 years, you've no books, no papers, nothing to read. I mean, you can imagine that if you're just sitting down on the floor now and you say, right, I'm going to sit here for the day and do nothing and have no communication with anybody. Well, if that day goes on for 5 years, you begin to wonder, well, what's going to happen? So, yes, you gradually, when you come out of that, it takes time. And this is where my experience in Trinity Hall helped me, because it enabled me to get back into life at a reasonable pace. When you say, now are you taking it more slowly? No, the answer is not, unfortunately. I still have to be careful, because I find it very difficult to say no when the many requests come forward, find it very difficult. And so I have to be very careful in that respect.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because obviously we're living in a world now where it's not encouraged to ever stop, as in we are glued to these smartphones of ours. And, especially the generation that's emerging now, it seems like they can't go a minute without looking at a screen. And I just find it so fascinating, the learnings from your time that you spent.
Well, it is actually, that's a very important point. I mean, I suppose as far as smartphones go and that, I'm as guilty as anybody for that.
Mm.
And I think I only said yesterday to a friend, I think the time is coming when one needs to just get away for a few days on some form of retreat.
Mm-hmm.
The retreat where you can be away, you can be quiet, you can leave your smartphones and everything behind and just have time to recollect yourself.
Mm.
And I think we need those pools of quietness in life. And in some ways, that one of the reasons why I'm an Anglican, but I became a Quaker, a member of the Society of Friends, because when you go to a Quaker service, you sit quietly and someone speaks only if they have something worthwhile to say. Whereas many of our church services today have become so noisy. They become so, jump up, sit down, clap hands. Well, all very well, but there's not the space for silence and for quiet meditation and recollection, which I think we all need. And it's not easy to get into. It's difficult to get into, but it's often avoided for a variety of reasons. The other thing I would like to say is, too, that about mobile phones and computers and so on, I think this is drastically affecting the way people think and behave. A man called Ian McGilchrist has written a very good book, or several good books on the functioning of the brain. The left side of the brain, left-hand side of the brain, is the side that measures and categorizes and so on. And the right-hand side is the area of imagination, creativity, and the arts. And he said so much is now dominated by the left-hand side of the brain, because our computers, you give yes, no answers. There's no room for ambiguity. It's either yes or no. On our roads, you're guilty or you're not guilty. If you broke the speed limit, no excuse, you've broken it. Everything is computerized in that way, and our thinking is becoming that way. And there's a need for really a real chronic need for imagination, for myth, for fable, for all that lies the richness of the right-hand side brain. We need to get them in harmony. And we're out of harmony. I think this is something that's affecting not just individuals, it's affecting the whole of society, and to our detriment, which is leading to a lot of anger, a lot of frustration, a lot of violence, and a breakdown of society. I think there are a number of one of them.
I agree. I was reading a fantastic book whilst away on holiday a couple of months ago called Stolen Focus by Johann Hari, which is very much talking about how we have lost the ability to have, to a large degree, these kind of rich, two-way, informed conversations where we actively listen to one another and without being distracted all the time. But we've lost the ability to, as you say, to be fully creative, to allow our imaginations to wander and our natural selves to rise to the fore. And it's something that deeply concerns me, but at the same time, as you say, I'm incredibly guilty of whiling away a lot of time aimlessly on my smartphone because it's a distraction from the things I really should be doing in life.
Well, the thing is also, you see, I think what is happening in our educational processes too. I mean, at one time, a university provided a holistic education. If you were going in to do a subject, you incorporated the arts as well as the sciences. They were together. Of course, there was a degree of specialization, but it was there together. Nowadays, the arts are gradually being pushed to the edge in favor of science. Now, that is driven by, of course, as they would say, economic necessity. We need more scientists. And of course, I agree with that. Of course, we need scientists, and scientists are essential in society. But we need those scientists too to have an appreciation of the fullness of life, and that's where the arts contribute to that. And I think it's a great shame that the arts are being marginalised in schools and in universities, which is not to my mind, not a good thing.
No, I agree. I mean, not to get political, but we saw that during the early stages of the pandemic, but it was the arts sector that was one of the hardest hit, ironically, at a time when we really needed the arts and expressive, creative expression more than anything as a form of escape during that time.
One way which science guides us is to be very literal, whereas life isn't totally literal. There's the area of imagination and creativity, which lies beyond the literal, the area of myth and fable. We're to be brought up as children with myth and fable is great because it stimulates the imagination. It takes you out of yourself, beyond yourself, into a new realm, a new world. And the role of religion, too. I mean, you don't take religion as being, necessarily scientific truth. There's a difference between scientific truth and religious truth. A difference between, and many people don't see that. They take it literally, whereas if you can see it symbolically, it has fundamental meaning, tremendous meaning for us in our lives.
Mm-hmm. So you returned to Lebanon 25 years after your release, and you met with representatives of the organisation that held you captive for so long. How important was it for you, Terry, to make that personal journey, and how did you manage to reconcile your feelings after being denied your freedom for so long?
Well, I think you've always got to look for opportunities for reconciliation. I mean, that's essential. If we're going to live as human beings and be fully human in this world, we've got to be able to be reconcilers. And it's no good saying, me sitting at home and saying, yeah, that's okay, that's up to the politicians. It's up to each one of us to be reconcilers in the area where we have possibilities. It's up to us. Now, I had a possibility there to at least attempt some degree of reconciliation with my captors. And so I went back to see them, 20 odd years before, 30 odd years, whatever it was, 20 odd years. They had captured me because they made me a promise that I was able to see someone who was ill, and that promise was broken. So I went back 20 odd years. And now they'd changed, some different people in charge, and so on and so forth. But they were surprised to see me. And they said, well, they did actually apologize because they moved on. They've moved beyond the stage that we're at when they captured me. They said, what can we do? And I said, well, I've just come back from the Lebanese border. I've seen refugees really in dire straits, cold and hungry. Can you let me have heating oil for them? They said, yes, we'll do it. Now, that was a very small gesture, very small gesture. But it's a step towards reconciliation. And that would have been followed up. I was due to follow that up, but then COVID intervened, and then the terrible events in Beirut with civil war and that terrible explosion. And so it's not been possible to follow it up. But I was ready to get back there. We're beginning to lay down the bare bones of a peace process to get things moving a bit in a different way. I don't think it's now going to be possible to do that because I'm now getting too old for these journeys and these travels. But at least made one small step there. And it's so easy to cut people off and to say, I'm not going to talk to you. I'm not going to have anything to do with you. Again, go back to the question, why are you doing what are you doing? What are the reasons for that? There are one or two people who are totally psychopathic, whom you can't reason with. Of course there are in society. But not everybody's like that, Not everybody is that way. It is possible, but you've got to have some understanding.
How much of a difference did it make to you to have that kind of reconciliation? Do you think you could have fully moved forward without that meeting?
Oh, yes, I think so. I think I could have moved forward, yes. But I just think it was something that ought to have been done. And at least I ought to have made a try at it. And I had a go at it, even though it didn't get as far as one would have wished it could have got. But there we are. It happened.
Well, such is life, isn't it? And you never know what's going to happen. And then COVID happened. And there's one thing. I'm conscious of your time. I just got a couple of other questions. There was one thing. I was rereading Taken on Trust recently. I've got my father's copy behind me, and you talk in the book about your relationship with your father, especially in his final years. And you talk about how that shifted towards the end of his life from you started to relate to him as a friend, not as an authority figure. But you also were quite self-critical of yourself for not being with him as circumstances happened on the weekend that he died. You and I have connected, and I've reached out following my own father passing away, who you'd met a few times through his work with the Suffolk Special Constabulary. I mean, I'm having to come to some very real realizations now as his son that I should have spent a lot more time with him in his final years. And I just assumed that I had plenty of time left for that kind of relationship to develop, a bit like how you've described, where our relationship would move on and shift. How much of a blessing was that period of time for you with your father to kind of rebuild that relationship in his last years?
Well, he became seriously ill. He died very, very young. He died in his mid-50s,
right.
Which is what my own children are now. So, I mean, that's very young to die. And I remember the consultant told me, he was under medical care, that he had terminal cancer and that his days were numbered. And so I said, have you told my father? He said, no. I said, are you going to? He said, I think you could do it. So I remember going to see him and telling him that his days were numbered. And that sort of was the turning point, really, in the relationship. It was a very, very difficult thing to do. Very difficult. I'm sorry he died. I really am sorry he died so young, because he missed seeing his children grow up. He missed seeing his grandchildren. And again, it's given me, because of that particular experience, an empathy again for people who suffer, thousands of people who suffer in the same way. I'm not unique in that respect by any means. There are thousands who've suffered in the same way. I can understand what support and understanding they need at such a time.
I think what's unique about you is how you've managed to use your experiences to touch so many people in a very positive way, and I think that's a real skill that you've managed to. A lot of people could have gone through what you've gone through and gone into their shells, but the fact that you've managed to turn this into all of the writing and public speaking and humanitarian work has actually meant that the impact of your experience has been so much more profound and widespread than it could have been. I think that's a real testament to yourself.
Well, that's kind of you to say so. I often feel that it's due to other people that one has been able to do what I've been able to do, and I've been incredibly fortunate in being able to maintain myself and my family during these years. I never thought I would be able to do that, but it's been possible. There we are. Here we are today, you and I talking. And I suppose now I'm in the last years of my life, and I want to try and make them as worthwhile as possible. I'm gradually withdrawing from some of the commitments because I can't manage everything, but at least one keeps going until the end.
I was going to say you don't strike me as someone who's ever really going to stop.
No, I don't think. I said I think I might consider retirement in 6 years when I'm 90.
Okay.
But even then, it'll only be semi-retirement.
But then something will draw you in, won't it? And there'll be something else to grab your interest.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, it's wonderful. Look, I'm so grateful and touched and honoured that you've been able to make the time today. This means a lot to me. I know it would have meant a great deal to my father too, who admired you immensely. And yeah, it's just wonderful to have the opportunity to talk about your story. And anyone that hasn't read your books, but particularly Taken on Trust, I would hugely recommend it because it remains as relevant and powerful now as it did. Well, I remember reading it as a teenager, so 20 years ago, and it has in a way it has more resonance now than it did back then.
Well, thank you, and it's been very nice to be able to speak with you. I extend all best wishes to those who are listening to this podcast. All the very best.
Thank you very much. So thank you to my wonderful guest today, Sir Terry Waite, and thank you for my brilliant producer, Lorette's Visuals, for producing this episode. This show relies on all of you to keep it moving forward, so please do join the conversation on social media using the hashtag GoodJourneysPod and subscribe to our channels, as it makes such a difference and allows me to keep sharing more inspiring conversations like this with the world. So that is it for today. I've been Ben Veal. My very special guest has been Sir Terry Waite. This has been Good Journeys with Second Mountain. So until next time, let's keep climbing together, and I'll see you all again soon.